Okay, well, welcome and good evening, everyone. My name is Clementine Jarrett, and I am a child rights advocate and a proud member of the OCIC Youth Policy Makers Hub. Thank you all for joining us, and I really hope that you enjoy this bit of the Youth Policy Makers Hub's Policy Matters series. To give you a brief about the YPH, which is the OCIC's Youth Policy Makers Hub. It is a diverse group of 25 youth members from Ontario, aged 20 to 35, seeking to engage in international cooperation, policy processes in support of gender equality. We also focus on Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, or FIAP for short, and we focus on the action areas of this policy, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs for short. You can find out more about us on the OCIC's website, and I believe that Pragya had put the link in the chat. All right, perfect. So this year, we are focusing on our flagship program for the YPH, which is the Policy Matters series. And this series is on the FIAP, so the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And every month, we have a specific focus on each of its action areas. So for today's session, we will focus on environment and climate action, which is action area 4 of the FIAP. And we are really thrilled to have Dennis Tessier as our speaker for today. So just for a bit of housekeeping before we begin, please note that this session will be recorded for note-taking, and it will be disseminated on the OCIC's website and social media platforms, and also for reporting purposes. Secondly, to keep in touch with us, please follow us on social media. The OCIC is on Twitter /X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, all of which are being shared in the chat as well. Lastly, the OCIC is committed to creating a safe and inclusive space. We ask all of you to commit to our code of conduct, inspired by those of the Inter-Council Network, the ICN, and Amnesty Canada. If you see or experience anything in conflict of the code of conduct, please do not engage directly. Just contact an organizer and we will respond appropriately. Before we proceed, it is essential to acknowledge the Indigenous shaping of the land on which we gather. The land is both a literal and figurative foundation to discussions on public policy. So with that, I will pass it on to Sagrika for a land acknowledgement. Thank you.
We at OCIC recognize and honor the Indigenous peoples who have historically and do presently live and work on the traditional, both treaty and unceded territories that we operate on. These include the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, and many others. We acknowledge that our staff, board, volunteers, members, and broader community operate on the treaty and unceded territories and numerous other Indigenous peoples and nations. As we reflect on our role within the settler colonial context, we acknowledge the importance of naming the Indigenous people and nations on whose lands we live and work play, and understand the importance of framing our engagement in the international cooperation sector and beyond through the lens of reconciliation and decolonization. We recognize that we have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples who have and continue to fight for social justice on their own lands. With this, we would like to move on to our next segment, and I would love to pass the floor to Raja and Sanya.
Hi everyone, my name is Raja and I'm going to be leading the Jamboard activity for today. I'm going to put the link in the chat so you all can head on there, but additionally I will be sharing my screen as well. So, or Sonia, do you want to share your screen? I don't, I never know how to share my screen. Actually, I see it. Okay, right, hold on. Let me get on there.
Yeah, the link is in the chat as well. And I think everybody should have access to it, but please let us know.
Yes.
if you don't.
All right, I am sharing my screen. Let me know. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the engagement activity for Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy. Policy Matters, Action Area 4. I'm sorry for the little typo, Environment and Climate Action. So we're gonna start off with some icebreaker activities, a simple true or false about what we know about SDG 13 and about the Action Area 4 of Environment and Climate Action. So we're going to start off with some true or falses. The main causes of climate change are natural factors such as oh, by the way, you can put the answers in the chat or you can just say them out loud. And in the next slide, we're going to go over the answers. So the main causes of climate change are natural factors such as volcanic eruptions and solar radiation. This one is, I have my answer. I'm going to say that this is probably false because there's many other factors that contribute to climate change rather than just volcanic eruptions and solar radiation. Human activity contributes so much, so I'm just going to say false for that. The goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. This one's a little bit, you have to know the Paris Agreement to understand this one, but give it your best go. Your best guess. Climate change refers only to increases in temperature. I'm going to say false for that one. Climate change mitigation focuses solely on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and does not include actions to adopt its impacts. And Sonia, do you mind getting on the chat and reading what people are saying?
Yes, of course. It's hard to keep track, but I think people are on the right track for sure.
So on the right track?
Yeah, like
Okay.
false, true.
Well, we're going to go on to the fifth one now. Urban areas contribute significantly less to global greenhouse gas emissions compared to rural areas. I'm going to say false for that one. But if we all have our answers in and we all have a pretty good idea of what, the answers are, we can move on to the next slide, which is answers. So for number one, it's actually false. Climate change encompasses various changes in climate patterns, including temperature shifts, extreme weather events, and alterations in precipitation patterns. So it's not just, like I said, factors such as volcanic eruptions and solar radiation. There's so much more. So it's actually true that the Paris Agreement aims to strengthen the global response to climate change by limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius to prevent catastrophic impacts. And number three was false. While natural factors contribute to climate variations, human activities, like I said, particularly the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, are the primary drivers of recent climate change. Number four, climate change, it's actually false. Climate change mitigation aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while adaptation includes adjusting to the impacts of climate change and building resilience to its effects. And number five was about urban areas significantly contributing less, which already was false. Urban areas are major contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions due to factors such as transportation, energy consumption, and industrial activities. I mean, I would assume that Toronto contributes a lot more than my little small town of Windsor, but that's just an example. How many can anyone say in the chat if they got 5 out of 5 or 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5? I can't see, so I'm just gonna
Yeah,
for your
I think
own.
a lot of people got 5 out of 5.
Oh,
so.
okay, that's good. So you guys are well aware with your SDG 13 knowledge. Alrighty, so these are some open-ended reflection questions that Sonia presented to us. Feel free to just use stickies or you can use the chat. I can't really see the chat, so if Sonia, if you can moderate this part, that would be great. But why is climate action important for sustainable development? How does climate change impact communities and ecosystems? How can communities enhance climate resilience? And how can countries enhance international cooperation for climate action, and how does SDG 13, specifically climate action, intersect with gender equality?
You can also pick which question you want
Yeah.
to answer. And even because a lot of them do intersect, of course. So it could be, one answer that addresses all of them, or this is also something that you can like take with you after this session and just sort of reflect on it. But this was just supposed to be a very open-ended reflection sort of section of the activity.
So if anyone put anything in the chat, or anybody put, I can answer. Oh, okay, perfect. We're getting some things. I can answer like the second one. How does climate change impact communities and ecosystems? I think that in developing countries, I know specifically I'm from Pakistan, so when the floods hit, that disproportionately affected women and children, and so the effects of of climate change was so heavy on people, on the villages, on the more northern areas, and women and children were severely affected by that, and they were forced to be displaced. So, climate migration, climate displacement due to climate change on developing countries, is how it basically impacts communities, and also the ecosystems, the farmers that were there. It affected their crops, it affected their well-being, and how they raise money to live. So that was all erased. So it's a lot different. And what I've learned is that climate change affecting us in North America is a lot different than how it is affecting people in developing countries. But we have some answers over here. So for number 3, someone said by prioritizing and validating sustainable living, which is honestly the best way that I think that we can really hone in climate action, is by incorporating it in our everyday daily lives. I know it's kind of hard, but maybe riding your bike more often rather than taking transportation, or even just recycling, really easy. I know that my friends have started, actually, instead of taking plastic waste, they're actually going to those shops where you can get it in glass jars, like get your household materials in glass jars. And so they're going completely plastic free and just, using those glass jars. So it's little things like those. Someone said to number 5, climate change disproportionately affects women and girls, particularly in developing countries. Yes, exactly. And so that was my answer to number 2, but that's basically how it also intersects with gender equality, isn't it? Because it's disproportionately affecting women and children. By mobilizing and collaborating on solutions, including women in climate decision. Yes. So, you know what? I was recently at CSW 68, and I think one of the most important lessons that I learned is that when you're at a high level forum, when you're at a high level political forum, is that you really need to have those marginalized voices up at the decision making table, part of the decision making process for any tangible change to actually come through, right? So I was so pleased to see that so many women and so many girls were in these spaces, specifically related to gender equality and climate action. Engaging in public policy that actively and uniquely discourages unsustainable corporate practices. Many companies do a lot of damage and are left unchecked. Yes, I do believe that companies should be held responsible, and there should be, laws set in place for what they can and can't do. So yes, like Sonia said, please reflect on these questions. If anything comes to mind at the end, feel free to put in the chat, but we will be moving on to the next activity. So this is a word association activity. Basically, I have put 4 starting words, and then all you need to do is kind of just respond with whatever that comes to mind. It could be a phrase, it could be a sentence, whatever comes to mind. So you can use the sticky notes. I actually provided them right here for the word association activity. So you can just put on the sticky note policy, like the word that you are wanting to have an association to, and then just put whatever comes to mind, and we can see the different things that everyone comes up with. Ooh.
Could you guys give an example, like what kind of things you guys expect us to put?
Yeah. For climate resilience, I think about women and girls who are in those developing countries who have undergone, harsh climate change effects and the effects of climate change and the roots and the realities of them. So when I think about resilience, I think about those women and children, who've undergone that and are, reaping those harsh effects and who are living through that. So literally anything that just comes to mind. If you think about policy, you can put, like, for me, the Paris Agreement. Anything basically.
Thank you.
But if we, okay, I see somebody putting in something. I was gonna say if we can't think of anything, we can go on to the next. Tax and corporations. Okay, we can come back to this one. I feel like people are a little stuck on this one. That's totally fine. And we can go to the next activity. So this is just a multiple choice question. What is the main greenhouse gas responsible for trapping heat in the Earth's atmosphere? A little technical, a little sciencey. If you know it, try and go for it. And you can use these sticky notes over here. The correct answer will be on the next slide, and I will share that with you after I get some answers. Okay, I think everyone mostly got this one. It was an easy one, yeah. So the correct answer is carbon dioxide, like everyone guessed. Good job. You guys know your science. Let's go on to the next. Which of the following is not a consequence of climate change? Increased frequency of hurricanes, sea level rise, decrease in average global temperature, or D, loss of biodiversity? Okay, C. Okay, we got some answers. Everyone's saying C, and that is actually the correct answer. Decrease in average global temperature is not a consequence of climate change, but all these three are. And then we have, what is a primary source of human-generated greenhouse gas emissions? Deforestation, agriculture, industrial processes, D, transportation. Yeah, this one was okay. We have some different answers. We have a C and we have a D. Does anybody else have any last guesses for that last fourth sticky note? Okay, so we have a variety of answers. D was actually the answer. It was transportation. So human-led, human-generated greenhouse gas emissions, transportation is actually the highest in that area. And we have our last activity here. It's a fill in the blank activity. And I also put a word bank at the bottom to make it a little easier. But yes, these are the four sentences, and then all you have to do is just guess the missing word. And if you want, you can just put a sticky note next to the sentence and then put your word that you think it is. Okay, so we have renewable. So we have renewable for the last one. Renewable sources, solar, makes sense. Makes sense. And then we have absorb, filter. That is, you know what, that word can literally work. But I do have a word bank down there, but that word does make sense. And then the Paris Agreement, I think someone put 2 well below 2 degrees. I think that was for the Paris Agreement one. Yeah, I think that's what they meant. Alrighty, so we can go on to the correct answers. So the Paris Agreement aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. I don't know if you remember, this is actually one of the first questions in the true or false from our first activity. But yeah, it's below 2 degrees Celsius. Second one was climate change mitigation involves reducing greenhouse gas emissions through actions such as transitioning to renewable energy and improving energy efficiency. So that was actually our second one, efficiency. And then someone said absorb and filter. Sorry, yes, absorb, filter, sequester. Same thing, right? Like who's even, doesn't have to be so specific, but yeah, sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then the fourth one is obviously renewable energy, sources such as solar and wind power are essential for reducing reliance on fossil fuels and mitigating climate change. And yeah, that is the end of our little activity for action area 4, environmental and climate action. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And I am, yep, and I am going to now pass it on to Sonia to introduce the speakers.
Perfect. Thank you, Raja, for going through that activity. And now I am honored to welcome and introduce to all of you Dennis Tessier, who is our speaker for today. Dennis has more than 20 years experience in the field of environment and climate change, having worked in 15 plus countries, including 12 years of experience in East Africa, where he founded and operated a pioneering nonprofit organization and 3 clean energy social enterprises. Dennis has implemented clean energy and environmentally focused projects for the World Bank, Global Affairs Canada, Nordic Climate Facility, Environment and Energy Partnership, International Finance Corporation, Harvest Fuels Initiative, and Jane Goodall Institute, just to name a few. Dennis served as the Technical Director, Environment and Climate Change at MEDA from 2017 to 2023, where he had organization-wide responsibility to build capacity, develop strategic approaches, and ensure environment and climate change was championed broadly across the organization. Most recently, Dennis has worked as a consultant, advising and developing environmental action plans for a global affairs project in Vietnam. Dennis is a graduate intercultural communications and community development from Cégep Marie-Victorin in Saint Hyacinthe, Quebec, and has a BA, honors BA in International and Comparative Studies from Huron University College, and a master's in Development Studies, focusing on poverty resource management from the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So welcome, Dennis. We're so pleased to have you here.
Thank you for the introduction, and I apologize for it being so long. I'll have to come up with a more snappy one later. Yeah, I'm glad to see such a diverse group of people coming together to talk about policy. Now, I met when I first received the invitation from the OCIC to present on this topic. I had just literally finished a conversation with a relative of mine, and it was a heated argument. And it was about Canadian politics, of course, and I think we've probably all had some of these with our family members. And I kept on trying to remind this family member that we have to stop looking at the personalities and focus on the policies, because that's truly how we can enact change in our country and in the world that we live. And then I finished the conversation and, quite frustrated, opened my emails and I saw this invitation and it said policy matters. And I said, right. And I thought, well, this might be a good match. This might be a good way to talk about what I do and what I believe around policy. So thank you for this opportunity. It's well received. First, I want to say that working with FIAP, I've done so as a project implementer. So not necessarily speaking from the Government of Canada's perspective, but from my own experience implementing, designing projects that are funded by Global Affairs Canada. So I bring that knowledge to this discussion. Policy is very important. It's I remember my very first experience as a child with policy, and I grew up in Northern Ontario. And I out hunting, and I remember my grandfather whispering over my shoulder saying, I don't think we should, shoot this grouse because there's not enough of them in this area, and we don't want to harm the environment. And him saying, we shouldn't do this, that was sort of my first, inkling into what policy is. And even though we didn't talk about policy, but we did speak about the next step, which is finding ways to protect that biodiversity in our area. And I've always engaged in these conversations with my grandfather, and I think that sort of, helped me to better understand and engage as an adult. Good policy is foundational. It sets the tone for the conversation. It says what we care about, and it also gives us the green light to imagine, to start, to take it and run with it. And that, in that sense, policy is incredibly important. It can also be destructive if it's designed the wrong way, if it comes with the wrong intentions. So it's very important to consider, and it's very important to engage in policy discussions. And I thank you for taking the time and energy to do that. I apologize. I'm recovering from a small cold that I received from my toddler. So my voice isn't 100%. So today, you're asking me to speak about FIAP and my experience with it. And first, maybe just a little bit of an overview. And I think you've probably had this shared with you from the documents and visiting the websites and stuff. But FIAP is sort of framed around, first of all, its international commitments. So this is the Sustainable Development Goals. This is the Paris Agreement. This is the COP15 on biodiversity and the G7 Nature Compact. All of these commitments and agreements feed into FIAP. Also, Canada's federal laws and regulations feed into FIAP as well. They are guidelines that inform it. Most importantly, the Impact Assessment Act, which all projects implemented under FIAP have to adhere to. And that's very important, especially if they're large projects that pose a threat to the environment. So if that is triggered, an impact assessment, then there are specific guidelines and procedures to follow to adhere to it. And then finally, we have FIAP itself, which falls under Global Affairs Canada, and it's aligned with Canada's Strategic Environmental Assessments, or C, as they call it, and Canada's, or FIAP's, environmental integration process. So there's a lot of different parts and components that come together that inform FIAP and give it its strength as a policy. Now, FIAP itself, the action area has sort of three specific focuses. And the first one being strengthening the environmental governance and enhancing women's participation in decision-making. The second is investing in low carbon and climate resilient economies. So this is where the technology and the adaptation comes in. And there's promoting environmental practices that support healthy, resilient, adaptive communities. And I believe this has been a lot of the area where I've worked on in the past few years. Sorry.
Thank you for sharing this, Dennis. Have you finished the introduction already?
Let me continue with a little bit more here.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
And I apologize if I'm taking too long. So my experience, as I had said, is working as an environment climate change technical expert and within a team of other design and implement projects and make sure we're compliant with the FIAP guidelines as well. And working with other specialists such as gender equality specialists and market systems specialists to make sure that we multiple mainstream each of these specializations within a coherent project. I began working with FIAP in 2017 when I returned from Tanzania after spending almost 15 years there. But the legacy of FIAP and Canada's leadership in gender equality spans more than 30 years. In fact, from what I've read, it actually dates back to as far as 1976, which is quite a length of time. And in my work in East Africa, many other donor organizations referred to Canada's role in promoting gender equality. So we have a long established reputation, a very good one in this area. And when I joined MEDA in 2017 and started working directly with FIAP projects, I already could see that there was a big change happening. Huge emphasis on environment and climate change as a mainstream component of FIAP. And just as on one last question, you know, FIAP originally in this with environment climate change, we've always focused on do no harm. And what FIAP really does is it encourages us to look for positive environmental outcomes in our work, not just minimizing the impacts of our project interventions, but actually to find positive outcomes. And when I first started working, environment climate change could have been just a couple pages in a project document. But the last project I worked on, it was a couple pages in the actual document, but it also included an 80-page environmental action plan. So you can see the evolution of how it's become such an important factor in projects implemented by or funded by Global Affairs Canada.
Thank you, Dennis. And I really like how you introduced this question about FIAP action area with your own story. And I find like you have lots of experience in this area. And since you already mentioned about the gender, and my next question actually is focus on like, could you suggest upon gender impact of climate change reflect back to the FIAP?
Okay. Well, first and foremost, and I see some of these questions arose in some of the exercises before. And the reality is discussing gender equality and climate change, they have to be discussed together because they're inseparable. That is just the reality of the work, particularly in regards to the Global South. For example, according to the FAO, up to 80% of farmers in the Global South are women. And 80% of the food is produced by women. And those are usually in rural households. So, and this is what the vast majority of the population in the Global South is dependent on. This is where their food comes from. And that just in itself just tells you how vulnerable that women are to the impacts of climate change. So if we look at changing climate patterns, rainfall patterns, drought, extreme weather events, all of those things contribute to impacts on women's livelihoods and essentially the well-being of households. There's also a bunch of other factors that feed into that. Women often are responsible for collecting firewood, collecting water. They're in charge for cooking food. The changes the distances in which they have to walk. They're more susceptible to violence and sexual-based violence. There's a whole host of issues that derive from climate change that are inseparable. And generally, we like to talk about this in terms of vulnerability and resiliency. And with every climate shock that happens, if there's a drought, that impacts the household. It reduces the amount of food produced, the amount of food that could be sold in market. It also reduces the stores of food for the household. They might survive a year with one shock, but what if there's a second shock the next year? Slowly that reduces the resiliency of that household. It increases the vulnerability, and with each shock, that pushes the family, the household closer to making decisions that they don't want to make. And this brings me to a story that's close to me, and I didn't put this in my bio when I submitted it, but I also sit on a board called Vega Education Fund, and one of our partner organizations in Tanzania is focused on girls' education. And the person running it, her name's Mesha Pius. She's a Maasai leader, and we've been friends for many years. And in the last 2 years, she's been sending me pictures of livestock that have perished. And I knew why she was sending me, not because she was concerned about the cattle, but she was concerned of what the impact of those cows dying would have on girls. And so she began asking me for ways to ensure that some of these girls that were most vulnerable to early childhood marriage could find tuition fees to get into school. And Vega Education Fund was able to provide some of those fundings. And the reality is there's millions, tens of millions of girls every year that do not go to school. And some of that is related to climate change, because as household incomes decrease, families have to make a decision between paying girls school fees or feeding the family, paying medical fees, etc. And I think if I was to change gears a little bit and start talking about, well, let's design projects, let's design interventions to ensure that we can get more girls into school or reduce the vulnerabilities of women and girls from climate change. But we also have to be careful that we don't design projects that create further burdens for women and girls. A recent example of that is designing a guide for sustainable agricultural practices. And one of my suggestions was the promotion of organic agriculture. And like I often or usually do is I try to get as many people to read the document as possible before submitting. And and one of my colleagues, a gender specialist, brought up the issue, well, who's gonna deal with these extra tasks related to organic agriculture, such as spreading fertilizer on the field? And that was a very good question, because that is one factor that might result in the failure of the project, because adding an additional task to a woman farmer's already very long list of duties could result in that not being a successful project or an intervention. So we always have to look at both sides of the intervention, like the challenge, the opportunity, but also the risks. In regards to the gendered impacts of climate change, we often look at a few different factors. And one is access and use. So ensuring that opportunities, products, and services are inclusive, accessible, and useful to women and other marginalized groups, while also supporting them to overcome constraints that may limit their access and use. We also look at agency and rights, which is the ability of ones to define their own goals, to make their own decisions and act upon themselves, increasing their participation, their voice, negotiation, and influence and decision-making power about strategic life choices. And then there's just an equitable enabling environment, which is probably the most difficult, which is looking at laws and social customs, norms, and the institutions that support those, and trying to transform behavior and decision-making power. So I guess in sum, when you look at gender equality and climate action, they're inseparable. They're both part of the same discussion, and we should approach that in that same way.
Thank you, Dennis. While you are talking, I'm actually taking the notes. A few highlights from what you say I really like is you start with different facts. For example, like 80% of the food in the world is produced by women. And also you share
South,
about
yes.
your own... Sorry.
Yes, in the global South.
Yeah, in the global South. And Also, you mentioned about your own experience, and I really want to like highlight this where you share. And I think that's a very valuable experiences. We need to make sure we do not create a further burden on women and girls if we design a project in global south. And like you share about your own experience and your reflection, and also mention about the different factors to think about when talking about gender impacts of climate change. And actually my next question will further talk about the government and what is the role of civil society in implementing the environment and climate action area along with government. And would you like to share some of your experience in this area to our participants?
Well, when I think of civil society, I think of all of us, right? We're all part of this big project of Canada and democracy and our role in the world. And I think the first big thing is that we need to get informed, right? Not just through social media platforms, but actually get engaged with policy, know what the priorities of our government is, and learn about the issues, right? Learn about the impacts of climate change on women, learn about energy efficiency, about transitioning to low carbon economies. These are all very important things that impact our lives and future generation lives. So the more we know, the more power we have. I think everybody's heard that slogan before. Um, as voting members in a democracy, we need to vote. We need to choose political parties that represent our ideals and prioritize environment and climate change. Um, and 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 democracy is not just about voting; it's about engaging. You know, joining forums. If if you hear about government soliciting, you know, information, getting your inputs, do so. Contact your members of parliaments. And I know your guide on how to effectively use advocacy. I read that a couple of weeks ago. It's very informative. Gives you a lot of very good discussions on how to engage with government, how to get your voice heard. So it's not just voting; it's about engaging. And also, I don't think we should wait for government to do everything. You know, we are part of this project, and we have the ability to lead as well. So engage in innovative projects, um, think, um, uh, get involved with other initiatives and organizations, and and look for things that you can invest in that have a positive environmental outcome. I think that's what I have to say on that.
Thank you, Dennis. You mentioned about as a civil societies, every one of us, we should get informed about the climate change and also learn about the issue, learn the related policy. And also we, as a voter, we should involve in the voting to vote for the political party has the climate change policy aligned with our own value. And also in the end, you mentioned we do not need to wait government to do everything in the individual level. We actually can engage in different projects or organizations like OCIC, and we can like do something from our own like personal level. And actually my next question, we want to talk more about how are the priorities of the action area for implemented. Could you share about a little bit your knowledge and your idea in this question?
Well, I think I've talked a little bit about sort of the focus areas of FIAP. So my experience really has been with the implementation of projects, and those are always aligned with FIAP's focus areas and priorities. So in that sense, you know, my experiences in that area, I think really like the key is to find projects that really reflect what the need of the communities that you work with are, first and foremost, right? And that takes a lot of partnership. So I know one of the key priorities for FIAP is to engage with governments and implementing organizations to have a meaningful conversation so that we actually are responding properly. And in all the projects that I've supported, that required us to often do quite an extensive scoping mission, engagement with national, regional, and local governments in the countries we would like to work in, and then co-designing proposals that reflect the need. And it's a fairly straightforward process to design a project. You know, you need your proposal, then once that's accepted, you sign a contribution agreement, and then it really gets into, you know, designing the project implementation plan, which is sort of the blueprint of how you are going to execute a project, and that includes a performance measurement framework, and that's where you build in all your indicators and what you want as your outcomes, and what activities will feed into that. And where I've always come into the picture is designing the environmental action plan and ensuring that the organization has the tools and resources to be compliant, to meet the requirements put forth by Global Affairs Canada. And the other thing is to make sure that environment and climate change is mainstreamed along gender equality and social inclusion, market systems, and other technical areas based on the organization's needs and the priorities of the country and the project area. One thing that Canada does, we follow the Rio policy markers, which is guidelines through the OECD, I believe. And so these are very clear guidelines, and there's plenty of environment climate change guidelines to do so. The last project I focused on had policy indicators around biodiversity, reduction of greenhouse gases, sustainable agriculture. So there's a lot of different indicators. What I can say that is that for Global Affairs Canada projects to be successful, from what I've seen, there have to be climate change adaptation components in it, and they have to have biodiversity alongside gender equality, and these need to be at a high level. So it's very important to get that combination right. And also having the local expertise on the ground is one of the great outcomes I've seen in projects that I've worked with, because project design and implementation is so much better, so much easier when you have that local expertise. And in my previous job, I was very lucky to have a community of practice, which was a global network of environment, climate change experts coming from different countries, different backgrounds, and they were able to really contribute across the board, designing projects for their countries, but also helping with ideas and information for other initiatives as well. So that didn't totally answer the question on, you know, the focus areas, but really the main thing is working with the implementing organizations, having conversations with governments that we work with, and and integrating that into the project design.
Thank you for sharing. And I also want to highlight one thing is you mentioned about when we design a project to helping the developing country, we need to make sure we really reflect the needs of the local community. And you also mentioned about we need to include the local expertise on the ground. And I think this is the topic we discuss a lot, no matter it's relate to gender or environmental change or lots of like education. And that's something I really value from your perspective. Yeah. And next, I will move to our last question. After this, we will open door for our participants to ask questions to Dennis. And before we move on, and I would like to know like I would say it's like a question probably most of the participants are eager to know is, as a youth, how can we contribute towards the issue about climate change and environment? Do you have any suggestion for youth?
Well, I guess it's a very like personal issue, but it's also it's a political issue. It's a global issue. It's part of our existence, our everyday life. As I already said, first get involved and informed with the issues. You're voting, get involved. We're a country with diverse ideas and capacities. We should take advantage of that. The one other thing I would say, and I maybe started with excuse me, started with this at the beginning of this conversation, is that speak with your friends and family. Get people involved. Environment, climate change, biodiversity, yes, they're complex, and we've over politicized it. The reality is these are important issues to all of us. Coming from Northern Ontario, I have family members that absorb information off social media and they don't quite understand it. They take certain political views, and I always try to like engage with them to try to get them to understand excuse me, that climate change impacts moose populations, it impacts fish populations, it impacts what times the lake freezes, how it freezes, is it safe or not safe. Everybody across the globe has similar conversations, maybe not with ice, but with water level, extreme weather events, droughts. So this conversation is relevant to all of us. So keep speaking to friends and family, keep speaking, having conversations. I think that's the most important. And if you have the time and energy, join organizations and movements and get involved.
And because you just share about joining like different movement and organization, if there is any like specific organization or movement you would recommend, I guess it will give us better idea to look for.
I saw that there's currently something through the Government of Canada for youth engagement. It was on LinkedIn. I hear OCIC is doing lots of things. The Canadian Council for International Cooperation is another one. If you're part of an organization already, there's the Canadian Coalition for Climate Change and Development. There are plenty of organizations in Canada to get involved with. You just have to choose which one most aligns with what you want to do.
Thank you. And I guess everyone has a better idea about FIAP Action Area 4. And the next part, I will open door for everyone to ask question to Dennis. And you can just unmute yourself to talk to Dennis directly, or if you cannot speak, you can type your question in the chat box and I can read that. Okay, I will give everyone 1 minute to think about.
I can ask a quick question. I'm curious to see if you face any barriers when you were in like all the different countries, obviously, that you visited, just in terms of implementing your goals for your nonprofit and sort of how you engaged the community while you were working on jumpstarting that. I'm always curious to see people's answers on how they choose community engagement.
So are you talking about the nonprofit working with girls' education?
Yeah, especially that. I think especially coming like as a white male, I think that presents, its own sort of barrier, especially when
Yes,
it comes to women and
yeah.
girls. So, yeah.
Well, how I get involved is I raise money in Canada and I leave all the work to the people who know what they're doing on the ground. So I've been blessed that I know everyone who's implementing on the ground in Tanzania. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to do it, to be perfectly honest. I would have found a charity that's already doing something in Canada and maybe made a donation that way. But I had the blessing of knowing every single person that was doing something in Tanzania, friends for many years. And so we were able to work on something together. So Mesha PS is a community leader and organizer already on the ground. I have been friends with her. She's a very trustworthy person, so it was very easy to engage with them. The other organization we work with, which is Kids Care Tanzania, I volunteered with that organization 20 years ago. So when we decided to do this, it was very easy to reach out to those organizations. And you're right. As a white male from Canada, if I was just trying to go and do that, it just I wouldn't attempt to do it, to be perfectly honest.
Okay. Sanya, if you have any like follow-up question.
No, I appreciate that response actually, because I find that in other sorts of circumstances, like I went to a talk a couple weeks ago and it was a project that they were implementing that was focused on dental care, providing dental care in Nigeria. And they had started from scratch and they were talking about completely like different barriers and how they had to engage the community leader, like you also mentioned. But I think it's curious and respectable actually that you wouldn't necessarily have gone through with this in the same way if you hadn't known those people and like were familiar with that community and the organization, because I feel like a lot of organizations do in fact engage when they probably shouldn't. So yeah, thank you.
And partnership is difficult. It's a trust issue, right? So and finding the right local partner on the ground in the country that you want to work. And I feel like this is where Canada has a unique opportunity. It's in a unique position because Canada has a lot of people that come from other places, and a lot of people that bring all of that knowledge. I spent 15 years in Tanzania, and every day that I lived there, I woke up and learned something new. So it takes a very long time to really understand a place, understand a people, how things work. And if you can leapfrog and work with somebody that's from that place, an organization that knows how to get things done in those unique environments, then why not use that to your advantage? And I think that is what makes international development successful and when it's done right. And I think it's a way to decolonize development as well. You can be an ally without doing everything. And even in my work implementing projects for Global Affairs Canada, with an organization implementing GAC funded projects, the most success was working with my environmental and climate change counterparts in country and supportive of them. And then the engagements were, if I traveled to the country, was to work with them and transfer some knowledge that I have, or support them with their work. And then they were the ones actually engaging on the ground. Sometimes it'd be fun to go see what was happening, but definitely I would not go as the expert. I would not feel comfortable because there's so many dynamics that are happening. So I'm an expert in some respects, but I'm also a team player. And it takes everybody to get something done right.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. I saw Biko raise his hand. Do you want to ask something, Biko?
Yeah, yes. No, I had a question. You talked a little bit about funding. This is also a little bit tied to your previous question, but you talked a bit about funding and um, working with bodies like Global Affairs Canada. And I think sometimes with funders, it can be a little bit like difficult in terms of allowing communities to go ahead with delivering projects in the way that they want to deliver projects when they have to do it within the mechanisms of sometimes funding relationships and reporting relationships, and the hierarchies that kind of exist there. So I'm just kind of curious on how you approach that, and if it's something that you've kind of seen with your work, especially just thinking about how the kind of whole funding landscape affects or is engaged in work, and how that supports or provides a barrier to just community-led efforts.
Yeah, it's always and I've implemented projects not with funding from Global Affairs Canada, but from other multilateral and country donors as well. It's always necessary to align, proposals with donor priorities and country priorities as well, and it's a balancing act. And I, from an environmental perspective, if I use Global Affairs Canada as an example, like in the projects that I've implemented with GAC funding, we need to meet the requirements to be compliant with our environmental standards in Canada. So that's a fact. But there's also, if the country that we're working in also has very strong environmental regulation, and we can prove that we've done our due diligence, we've gone through, we have government approvals, and it meets the standard, then usually there's flexibility there. In my experience, and you just need to document that and say, look, we've done this environmental screening. This is what we've proposed. It's compliant with local government. We have all the procedures. And usually, if there are strong environmental regulations in that country, they will also meet what the requirements are through the project. But yeah, it is difficult, and that's probably one of the challenges with development, right? And that's part of the idea around decolonizing development, is to make it, refocus it on the priorities of the recipient country or partners. And I think it's improving a lot over the years. Certainly I've seen that in the projects I've worked with over the last few years, but still, yeah, it's if it's donor money, they have a say, and hopefully both sides of that conversation get time to speak, and something positive comes out of it. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you Biko's question. And I think we have one more question for this session. If anyone want to ask anything, please take this chance. Okay, anyone? If nobody has any question, I actually have a question to Dennis, because I saw you have 12 years experience in East Africa, especially you leading the clean energy social enterprise. I'm especially curious about, like, could you share with us a real life example, like how do you use clean energy to help the to assist the local community in developing strategy in the addressing the climate related issue, and what's your lesson learned from that?
Wow, that's a great question. So for 12 years of my life, all I talked about day and night, 7 days a week, was improved cook stoves, biogas, solar lighting. So I first took it on as a hobby, and then I became very engaged with it, and then I decided to start up an organization that just trained and educated people around it. It was very difficult to talk to people about climate change when they were hungry. That's the reality. So I have a famous picture somewhere of me speaking to a room of probably 60 people, and everyone is completely asleep, because the reality of it is, if you don't know where you're going to get your next meal, if you don't know how you're going to pay school fees, if you don't know how you are going to get your kid into the hospital, worrying about sea level rise in 10, 15, 20, 50 years is very far away from, your worries. So you always have to engage people at their level. Try to understand where they're coming from, what their need is. And that was a very important lesson for me early on in my life, is always to engage and try to understand where is that person coming from. And so whenever I was selling a cook stove, I talked about the cost of a bag of charcoal and the efficiency of the stove. So if you use this stove for 1 year, how much charcoal would you save, and how much money would that translate to? If you installed a solar light in your house, excuse me, how much kerosene would that save? And how much does a liter of kerosene cost? And how much money would your family save at the end of the year? And I found that the best way to have those conversations is women entrepreneurs speaking to other women, because they understand each other, they can talk at the same level. And I've learned this through, selling cook stoves and solar lights. And that's when I also learned to back away. Like, I'm not the right person to be doing this, but let me see how I can be an ally, and let me see how I can support those who can do it well. And I have so many wonderful stories, and one of my women's sales agents became my sales manager, and then she left us for a much better job, and then she becomes her own business person, and she has her own shop. So I call her boss now. But every time I visit Tanzania, we go and have lunch together, and it's just knowing who you're working with, their priorities, their needs, and also learning how to work with people's strengths, right? It's you have to remove the ego out of it and just look at how can we do the best job possible here.
Thank you. I really like the story you shared. Especially, I really resonate. You mentioned about like you have a hard time to educate the people about climate change when they are hungry, and then you figure it out. It's better to find women entrepreneurs to speak to other women about this issue. The reason why I ask is because I also have a social entrepreneur experience. When back then I was leading a project in rural China, and I tried to help the kids with their mental health issue. But the challenge is kind of the same. When the kids are struggling to get a better grade so they can get a better university, nobody really care about their mental health issue. So I also have a hard time to educate people. And also I like your idea about we should remove our ego and to see what the people really need and to educate them in their level. That's the most important part. I guess I also see other participants mentioned in the chat box. They also find it's a very good point.
There's a very famous comedian, Jordan Klepper, who released a video, a TED Talk, and he said, we have to give something, right? You have to give something up. And that's how you begin to have the conversation. Because if it's always wanting to take, or make your point win the conversation, you're never going to have a conversation. So you have
Right.
to give something up. And
Yeah.
I think that's an important lesson.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. If nobody has any question, I will pass on to Pragya to close our session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angelina. Thank you so much, Dennis, for sharing your insight and expertise. It has been such an honor and pleasure to learn from you. I will, and I'm sure all of our participants will continue to reflect on today's discussion. And with that, I'd also like to thank our YPH members, Clementine, Angelina, Raja, Sanya, and Sagrika, for all their efforts in making this session a success today. With this session today, we are officially concluding this cohort's Policy Matters series, and I invite all of you to stay tuned to our social media for upcoming events and projects that the YPH members have been working on. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you again.